this kind of thing is scary to you, then this video is perfect for you, because today I'm going to give you a crash course in artificial lighting for photography. First of all, you might wonder why you should even need to use artificial lighting. After all, a lot of photographers don't ever use it, right? For example, outdoor photographers, wildlife photographers, street photographers. But I think there are also a lot of other photographers who would actually like to use it or would really benefit from using it, but they're a bit scared, they don't know how to use it, or they think it's too expensive. However, actually, artificial lighting only has to be as complicated as you make it. You can already take incredible photos, for example, with one strobe light and one basic reflector. Now, I actually love using artificial lighting, I do it all the time, and that's because it has so many benefits. First of all, you can take photos at any time of the day without depending on daylight, very handy. Second, big advantage, you can create all kinds of lighting effects. You know, you can do a kind of Rembrandt lighting, like in a painting, for example. And finally, you have total creative control. Yeah, so with artificial lighting, you can create light and shade exactly where you want it. So I thought it would be best to split this video into two parts. In part number 1, I talk about the main types of studio lighting. And in part 2, we talk about the actual principles of studio lighting, basically how to do it. So obviously, let's start with part 1, the main types of studio lighting. Basically, you have two different types. One is continuous light, one is strobe light. Continuous lighting, pretty straightforward, refers to any lighting that stays on after you switched it on. I've got an example here from my studio. It's one of those, I don't know, stage lights, construction lights even. I think a lot of people start using continuous lights because they're easier to use, and they do have some advantages. Number 1, this is a big one actually, is that you get a preview of the lighting effects. So when you set up your studio, you can already see where the light's going to shine onto the model, so you know what effect you get. Next, the lights are simply super easy to use. You just switch it on, it stays on. You don't need any devices to sync it with your camera. Super beginner friendly. The next advantage of the continuous lights is they can give you a really cool cinematic look. I'm going to show you one of my photos as an example. You can actually see the light in the picture because it's part of it. So that's the effect I got with one continuous light. But unfortunately, these continuous lights also have some disadvantages. That's why I don't tend to use them anymore these days. The big one, number 1, is they get extremely hot. So if you're the model, it's very, very uncomfortable to sit in front of this light. And also there's a high chance of burning yourself. I have definitely done that, not just once. The next disadvantage of these lights is that they are not as versatile because they're not quite as powerful as the strobes, and they're hot and stuff. So it's not so easy to get certain effects. For example, look at this photo, which is a sort of high-key style. It would be quite difficult to get that with continuous lights because they're not strong enough, usually. And the next disadvantage is these continuous lights, they don't really tend to overpower ambient light. So if you have, for example, neon lights on in your space, or there's some outside light or whatever, when you use a strobe light, they just drown everything out. Whereas the continuous lights, sometimes they're not strong enough, so then you have a weird mix of light and it just looks messy, and yeah, you don't want that. So then, let's talk about strobe lighting, which is the other type of light you could have in your home studio or studio. Strobe light simply refers to these power packs that you sync with your camera, and they deliver a flash only when you press the shutter button. So they're not continuously on, they only fire whenever you take a picture. There are many types of strobes. I like the so-called monoblocks. So what are the advantages of strobe lighting? Well, first of all, they are extremely powerful, which is so handy for so many situations. Especially, as I said, if you have ambient light somewhere and you want to drown it out, the flash will take care of that. The next advantage is that because these strobes are so powerful, you can actually lower the ISO on your camera, so you get less grainy photos, and it's always good to have a low ISO. Next advantage, these strobes are just super versatile. You can do anything with them basically. You can do super high lit photos or very moody dark photos, whatever you want. Now, of course, strobe lighting also has some disadvantages. I think a big one for beginners especially is that you don't have the preview of the lighting effect. Obviously, because the flash only fires when you take a photo, otherwise it's not actually on. So when you set up your lighting, you can't really see where the light falls onto your model. Now, to remedy this, these flashes do have a so-called modeling light. You can see it here. This light bulb is not actually the flash, that's this one. This little light bulb only emits a very weak light, so the effect is obviously not as strong as the flash once you take the photo, but at least you can see a little bit where the light's gonna fall, so that's pretty handy. The next disadvantage of strobe lighting is the so-called maximum sync speed. So you know in your camera, right, when you take a photo, there is the mechanical shutter of the camera that closes and then it opens again. And if you have a shutter speed of around 250 usually, when you take the photo, the flash fires for a short time only, right? And the shutter then is not quick enough, so to speak, to get out of the way, so you have this half black thing in your photo, which is really annoying because it ruins every image. So this happens when the shutter speed is too fast basically, and usually for every camera model you have a maximum sync speed. You can look that up on Google or in your camera manual. For my camera I think it's 200th of a second, so I have to keep my shutter speed at that or lower, otherwise I end up with this black curtain in my photos. And then the next and the last disadvantage of the strobe lighting is that you need some kind of device to connect it with your camera. I have my little trigger here. So you just pop that on top of the camera in the hot shoe. It's super easy to use, but it is of course an extra thing you have to buy and set up and all that stuff. So it's maybe not as beginner friendly as, switching on the continuous light. Okay, so that out of the way, let's now go into the second part, which is the principles of studio lighting. How do you use it? By the way, you don't need an actual studio for this. I'm doing all of this in my living room. No photo studio required. So to use studio lighting, you need to understand a few principles of how light works. First of all, let's talk about the difference between soft light and hard light. So when I talk about hard light, I simply mean light that's not diffused, but focused. And this kind of light casts very harsh shadows, and there will be a very defined edge between light and shade. Examples for this sort of light are direct sunlight at noon, the flash from your camera, it's very harsh, or if you use a light source without a light diffusing modifier. For example, if I just use this flash with this sort of reflector, it will be pretty hard light, because the light, just bounces back from the silver coating and there's nothing to make it softer to diffuse it, so you will get very harsh shadows. If you're photographing people, if you're doing portraits, you probably won't use this lighting very much because it is sort of as unflattering, you get these shadows under the eyes and it doesn't look the most pretty. But it is a look you can experiment with, and there are some photographers who use it quite a lot. For example, the German photographer Jürgen Teller. And then, in contrast, let's talk about soft light. So soft light simply refers to light that is diffused in some way. So it's not as harsh, it's not directly focused, and that means that there is a much softer transition between light and shade. Now outside, this actually happens naturally on a cloudy day because the clouds act as a sort of natural diffuser. Obviously in the studio you don't have clouds, but you can use all kinds of devices to recreate that kind of soft light. Most photographers will use softboxes that have this kind of the light diffusing material in front, which will make the light super soft. So to sum up, in general, you want to keep the following rules in mind. You can make light harder by using a smaller light source, because the smaller the light is, the harder the light. You can also focus the light to make it harder. So for example, if you have a cardboard tube or something in front of the light source, it will kind of focus the light rays and make the light harder than if you just took the cardboard tube away and it had more space to spread out. And you can make the light harder by using reflectors like this one that I showed you earlier without a diffusing material. And then in contrast, you can make light softer by using a modifier with a light diffusing material. Yeah, something like this. Or you can make the light softer by using a bigger light source. The bigger the light source, the softer the light. Or you can also make the light softer by moving the light source closer to the subject. Then the next thing to keep in mind when you're using artificial lighting is how do you position the light source, and also, therefore, where are the shadows? So when you're setting up your studio space, for example, if you're taking a portrait, that's something you always want to think about. Where do you want the shadows to be, if at all? For example, if you were to put the light source right in front of the model, sort of here, you get a super even light, very flat light, because the shadow would be behind me, so you wouldn't have any kind of pronounced shadows on the face. Next example, if you were to put the light source at a 45-degree angle more or less to the side, now the light would fall onto one side of my face only, and it would produce a shadow on the other side, right? And if you didn't want those shadows on the other side, you can then use something like a reflector or a white foam board or something, even white cardboard, to brighten that up. Another extreme example, if you were to place the light source behind the model, obviously the light is facing forward, so the shadow is basically on me, so I'm in a silhouette in this case. If you're a bit confused by this, it can actually help to practice this with something like an apple or so and a small light source, and place the light in different positions and see how it changes the shadow that's falling onto the object or away from the object. Also, what's super handy if you want to learn more about this is to study other photos actually, because you can usually see where the light source was placed. This is kind of like a fun game actually. I'm going to show you some diagrams to illustrate this. Here in this photo, I took this photo myself, and you can see that the light source was placed in front of me at an angle. You can see that because you can see the shadow behind me on the tiles at an angle, whereas you see that on the right side there's no shadow. Then look at this photo here. This is a really good one because you can see that the light was clearly hitting from the left side. Well, viewed from the front, obviously. You can see that the left side of the face is lit and the right side is basically dark. So this person didn't use a reflector or something. I think they only used one light source on the left side. Maybe it was a window actually. Then look at this one. Here you can see that the light is hitting from above at an angle because the whole face that the model is turning towards the light is lit. And then you see some shadows underneath the chin and cheekbone because there's obviously no light on the left side, you know, underneath her. That's why these areas are darker. And then here's another silhouette photo. Again, you see that the light source is actually behind the model. Therefore, no light is reaching her from the front, meaning she's totally dark. And last thing about shadows, by the way, shadows don't have to be a bad thing. So sometimes you want to do like a commercial portrait, of course. Then you're trying to get the most soft light, most flattering light, probably, to make the skin look nice. But maybe you want to do a more painterly photo or something a bit moody and like a character study almost. Then you can also work with very little light and a lot of shadow to make the photo more three-dimensional and more interesting. Okay, in the final part of this video, I just quickly want to talk more in detail about how to modify the light, meaning how to manipulate it to your liking. So with these so-called light modifiers, you basically have three options. Number one, we already talked about this one, you can make light more soft or more flattering. Number two, you can shape light. And number three, you can restrict light or block light. So then, for the first type of modifier, light diffusing or flattering modifiers, you have so many options. You can get a softbox. Here is one that's foldable, collapsible, very handy. This is octagonal shaped. And then you see it has silver coating on the inside. So you can just use that, or to make it even softer, obviously attach the white material in front. Instead of a softbox, you can also use an umbrella. Oh, I have one here. So that's also like a softbox kind of thing. And again, you put the white diffusing material in front. The next option is a beauty dish. That's what they're called, because they make you look so beautiful. They look a bit like a satellite dish. They're usually round and they make the light really soft and flattering. And one of the really simplest ways to create more flattering light is a reflector. So here's a typical one that you get everywhere, basically. They're collapsible, right? And then you have the silver side, then you have a golden side, and you can take this whole thing off. And then usually in the middle you have this frame which only has white material on it, which you can also use to diffuse the light. So these are super handy. Basically 4-in-1. And by the way, if you're at home and you need some kind of DIY solution because you don't have a softbox, you can simply use, for example, a translucent shower curtain or baking paper or what's that called? Parchment paper. Anything that's sort of light diffusing, but safety warning, make sure it's heat proof if you have a hot lamp. Then the next category, let's say, of light modifiers are modifiers that shape the light. Then you get an effect like this one, for example. And that photo, I took it with a so-called snoot. I love that word. And you just put that in front of your light source, and then obviously the light gets super focused, so you get that spotlight effect. Another way to shape the light is using a light with so-called barn doors. So here you have them. So you can see you can then shape the light, you know, with these little doors. And finally, maybe you actually want to restrict light, yeah? You want to block the light from certain areas. That's also sometimes necessary. Easiest way to do this is use black fabric. Something like black velvet, for example, is great. And just hang that in the areas where you don't want light. And then my favorite item in my whole studio is something called a honeycomb grid. That's what it looks like. And you just put that in front of your softbox or your beauty dish, and it creates a really, really nice kind of like three-dimensional painterly light. I've used it in this photo, for example. And that's it, actually. If you have any questions, leave me a comment and obviously make sure to subscribe. Bye!